after so long, and on such an auspicious time as this as well, because we are basically in New Zealand for the very first time facing a genuine political pushback against the New World Order and various other forms of political scumbaggery. And it's good to have you on here for your time and your expertise to give us a wee bit of advice coming from a country that has, in fact, at one point at least, thrown off the chains of tyranny.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Vinny. It's I've often thought about what's going on there in New Zealand since I was there maybe 10, 12 years ago, and what a beautiful place you have. It's sort of like being out in some of the remote areas of California where I live, some beautiful country. But then when you get into the cities and you see the political pollution and the ideological pollution that exists in the media, you think, oh my gosh, what's happening to this beautiful world of ours? We've got to move the clock forward, I would say. Some people would say move it backward, but I think our enemies have been moving it backward, and now we've got to move it forward again, because they're pushing us back to the Middle Ages. They're pushing us back to the time when tyranny was the accepted norm for people. And yeah, I like your word, pushback. That's exactly what we're here to do.
Yes, indeed. It reminds me of a scene from the Raiders of the Lost Ark when the Nazis came to do a dig site and they hired every single available worker in the area, so Indy couldn't get his own guys, and they paid them pittance and they treated them terrible. And John Rhys-Davies' character said, "It's as if the pharaohs have returned."
Yes, that's a good analogy. That it is the pharaohs. That indeed. I think. Thank you for putting that in my mind. Now I'm probably going to start referring to these people as the pharaohs. Mm-hmm.
So, did you have a chance to look through the NZPP website and that kind of thing yet?
Oh, yes, I did. I found it very interesting. And it's good to see that there's a spark of interest in making change and revision and doing something better than what we have. So, indeed, I did look at it.
So what was your first impression there?
Well, let me think about that for a moment. My first impression was that, what am I looking at here? Am I looking at a proposal for a constitution, or am I looking at sort of a string of slogans and hot button issues? Am I looking at a political document, or am I looking at a recruiting document, and so forth? So I tried to look at it first in that broad view before I started reading it, and it didn't take very long before I saw that it was kind of a statement of discontent with the existing system, a lot of attention paid to what's wrong with the existing system, and when it comes to the solutions to those, however, I was a little, I think disappointed is way too strong a word, but I was looking for something more
substantive,
substantial, something that you can hang your hat on, rather than just let's fight for freedom sort of thing, or let's get rid of the bad guys and let's have transparency and a lot of things. And I thought that the document, probably because it's in its early stage, and I understand the difficulty of doing something like this.
That's right. I mean, all the policies and things of that nature were due for release next week. This political movement's just come out of absolutely nowhere and just running to catch up at this point.
Yes, I'm very in tune with the challenge, because for quite a while now, so long I'm embarrassed to admit it, I started the project 2 days or 1 day after 9/11. I was all motivated, like so many people were, fired up. I could see right away that there was something very, very wrong with the scenario. And I thought, my gosh, we've got to fight back. And I started to write something on the next day. I wasn't sure where it would go, but I've been writing it ever since. And I finally realized we'll talk about a little bit that later in the program, because some of it is published now on our website, the Freedom Force International website. As I write and complete sections, I put them up on the internet. So in a way, the book is already being published. But what I came up with out of that, this continuing process, is that we needed to know what we were for, as well as what we were against. It's pretty easy to know we don't like to be pushed around. We don't like people telling us what we have to do, especially when we realize that they're that they are not very trustworthy people themselves. We don't like being fooled. We don't like being lied to. We don't like being taxed out of existence. So it's pretty easy to raise a lot of opposition to the things that are going on that we don't like. But very seldom do these kinds of movements come up with a statement of principles of what they do like. And so I'm reminded of that fact every time I look at a political statement of this kind. It's usually mostly about what we don't like. But when it comes to suggestions of what kind of a system are we going to build, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, what are your principles? Not the issues. The issues are endless issues. Every day there's a new issue that pops up, and you could probably make a list of 10,000 issues. We like this, we don't like that. But those things come and go, and you can solve one, and then there's another one that you have to consider all over again, unless you have a template to measure these issues by, and that template would be based on principles.
So these basic principles that we've outlined at the moment are freedom, sovereignty, independence, transparency, and accountability. These are indeed 5 principles that the government does not possess, or at least seem to show.
Yeah. Well, they say they do. That's the point. You can look at any government document, and they list those attributes that you just mentioned as what they do. Because nowhere is that defined. What is transparency? To what extent? When is it good not to have transparency? And the answer, of course, from our opponents is, well, in case of national security. So everything that comes at us is an issue of national security. So we've got transparency, except for national security, but all the important issues are now described as an issue of national security, so you're not allowed to know what's going on. So it takes more.
You would see people
saying transparency.
You would see people being dishonest, and then other people would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's very illogical. And I think that's because they believe that psychopaths and organised crime are not in charge of government.
Well, yeah, that's the problem. The general public has a lot of belief systems that are not in touch with reality at all. But I think anybody that's read a couple of history books, or even one good history book, they would understand that all governments, regardless of how they start out, even as they start off as like our own country did, as it's not really a government at all, but a protectorate that was designed not to govern people, but to protect people. No matter if you don't have an alarmed, or not an alarmed yet, but alarmed, of course, but an aware citizenship of what it takes to keep that system, the principles underneath it, well, then all governments throughout history, regardless of how they've started, have gradually evolved into organized crime syndicates. Because we have given power to these entities and say, yes, protect us against foreign foe, protect us against crime, protect us against pandemics, protect us against terrorism, protect us against pornography, protect us against drugs on the street, protect us, protect us, protect us. We give you all the power you want, and you protect us, and then you enslave us while telling us that the reason you're enslaving us is to protect us. And so they've really done what we've asked them to do. So when I look at documents like this, I look at it from the perspective of our enemies, these people who are the heads of the criminal syndicates. They love phrases like that because they can turn them around and use them against us unless we really lay it out and define these words at the same time we use them. Now, that's where it gets difficult, to define what that means and what it does not mean. Once that is done, now we finally cross the we've crossed the Rubicon, because once you defined it, you can't undefine it. So that's my first thought, and I'm really alert to these issues because I decided in this book that I'm working on that my last chapter is going to be, and I'm coming right up to it now, is going to be a legal document which could become the basis for a constitution for a country, a charter for a city or a county, or a one world system. The principles, in other words, are going to be laid out in this statement of why people need to surrender their freedom. Under what conditions is it justified for people to turn over to another group of people the right to use physical force against them? We have to be very clear on that. And if we are clear on that, we know it's not very far. It's only for the defense of life, liberty, and property. Nothing else. Nothing else. If it doesn't satisfy the movement to defend a person's life, liberty, or property, then it's not going to be justified as a basis for using physical force against another person. Once that is understood, then all these issues go away. You don't, because you use that formula, and if you understand that that's the formula, for example, and somebody says, well, should we force people to close their shops on Sunday? Well, of course, go back to the principle. Does that protect life, liberty, or property in any meaningful way? The answer is no. Well, then the answer is no. You can't force anybody to close their shops on Sunday. You can't force anybody to do. Yeah, most of 99% of the laws that are on the books today, which people approve of, by the way, including a lot of the people who are behind this revision to come up with a new constitution, they probably approve of most of the laws. They just don't like the really bad ones. And yet most of them violate these basic principles. So until we get to understand what the principles are, we're going to muddle around and probably not make any great changes. So at the end of all this dissertation of mine, I'm just saying that I'm going to be a proponent of let's talk about principles rather than issues. And the principles have to be spelled out. They have to be defined in every little detail so that nobody can come along 100 years from now and say, well, that's what they wrote in the Constitution, but we think they meant this. You follow what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, it reminds me of a Bill Hicks sketch where he was making fun of televangelists in the early 90s. He was sitting down watching television and one of them said, well, I think what God meant to say.
Yeah. Well, what God was really telling us, if we just listened, all those things, yeah. Well, that's the point. When constitutions are written, including our own, unfortunately, the drafters of the Constitution didn't put in the annotations in the left column. In other words, if our Constitution, which, by the way, doesn't really tell us much in the way of ideology, it says this is what you can do, this is what you cannot do, this is how many votes you get, and this is what the powers are. There's no ideology, no argument in the Constitution. That's all in the debates. It's in the books and the arguments, the debates, the pamphlets that went up to the formation of the Constitution. Had the Constitution been written in 2 columns, which I would love to have seen done. Someday maybe I can do that. In fact, the one I'm going to produce will have 2 columns. The Constitution will be on the right side, and on the left side will be the annotations, which says this is why we did that. This is the reasoning behind that. Now we can read that document and we get, oh, I see, this is why we have a division of power between the legislative and the judicial and the executive. This is why. Otherwise, you can say, read the Constitution, and people will read it, but they don't know why it was done that way. So this is my contribution to this discussion. I'm hoping to stimulate some curiosity as to what the principles are that we really believe in, and then when we start to define those and make them very specific, that we mean this and not that. And then once we do that, we've made a huge step forward in the development of political liberty.
In terms of defining political liberty, how would you define that?
Well, in essence, I already did, but let's do a little bit of a backtrack on it. The first step is to understand where the power comes from. Who has this power to use coercion against another human being? And let's not forget, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about laws. We're talking about constitutions which justify the use of physical force against another human being to kill them if necessary. And then we say, well, we will use the coercion of the state, which means the lethal power to kill people, for these purposes. Now, but people forget that that's the underlying force of law. You're going to enforce this even to the point of executing people if they don't do it. Now, obviously, most people don't get executed. They just get fined and imprisoned and restricted and all that kind of thing. But when we approach these things, we have to say, well, who gives us the right to tell these elected officials that they can carry a gun and shoot us and kill us? We better be very careful as to under what conditions that's allowed and under what conditions it's not allowed. Get my point. So the question is then, where does this power come from? Well, it comes from each of us. It's on the assumption that the state derives its just powers from the people. Now, in the beginning, that's not the way. All states derive their powers from the conqueror. It was conquer by sword, and that's where the power came from the sword. But ever since the French Revolution and on then through modern times, we got this idea that the people themselves are the source of legitimate political power. So, and this is what we want it to be. So we say we have the right to defend ourselves, to use physical force, to use lethal force if necessary. To do what? How can I justify killing somebody? Pretty limited, I would say. And when you really think about it, it comes down to three things. You can use it logically to defend your own life. Nobody would complain that you killed somebody because they were trying to kill you.
Well, actually, under current New Zealand law, there is a... you know how you would say reasonable force in the United States? In New Zealand, you have to have equal force. So if somebody comes and attacks you with a knife, you have to defend yourself with a knife, even if they've come into your home or something like that. It's just foolish.
It is foolish, but the principle remains the same. Now, the foolishness comes in not with the principle, but with the whoever wrote the description of what you can use and what you cannot use. That's the foolish part. But the principle is the same, that you can use a knife. Okay, you can use a knife to kill a person, or you can use a club, or you can use whatever, you can use a baseball bat or a bowling ball. Who cares? I mean, that's a side issue. The principle here is that you can defend your life with whatever it takes to do it. You can defend your freedom also. If somebody's trying to enslave you, by golly, nobody would complain that you fought back. You don't want to be a slave. That's the same as taking your life. That's even worse in many ways.
Apart from slavers. Slavers would be very upset about it.
Apart from slavers, yeah. Fortunately, they're not, well, now we're talking about they are the ones who are writing the rules nowadays. So that's exactly the problem. But if we go back to the principle of all power to the legitimate powers from the state come from the people themselves, those are the things that the people have a right to use a lethal force for, and therefore those are the only things that the people can delegate to their elected representatives. You cannot give them the right to imprison people or fine people or to kill people, because they open their shop on Sunday. So how can you then say, I elect a representative and let him pass a law to do things that I myself cannot do? Therefore, I cannot delegate it to my elected representative, and therefore they can't do it. So once you start with that principle, that all power for force comes from the people themselves and is restricted only to what people morally can use to defend themselves, and if we understood that the purpose of the state was to implement that and that only, and everything beyond that is not allowed, it's a very simple concept. Except, as you point out, well, then we got to say, what weapons can you use? All that. Fortunately, we have courts for that kind of thing to resolve this little issues. But the big issues fall on the principles. So, what is the function, the legitimate function of the state? To use lethal force or any kind of force is to protect the lives and liberty and the property of its citizens, nothing more. So that's my short answer to that. And I created, but many people contributed to that, Creed of Freedom, which outlines this philosophy in more detail. And it's not that complicated, really. Oh, thank you. You flipped over to it. If you go to the top of that page there, you'll see the Creed of Freedom. There's a little prologue to it, and then there are certain principles down below which explain what we believe as the proper function of the state. And these are all principles. These are not issues. Principles. These principles will be the same 100 years from now as they are today. Whereas most political platforms are issues, are we going to, what's our position on this issue and that issue, and 2 years from now the issue's gone, not even an issue anymore. So that's believe it or not, that's the short answer to your question.
Intrinsic nature of rights, money without coercion, equality under law, supremacy of the individual, the great leader, freedom of choice, property rights, equal human rights, proper role of the state. These are the principles, essentially.
Those are the principles, yes, stated in very concise terms, and in most cases they're in enough detail. That's the important part. Enough detail so that it leaves no room for doubt as to what it means. You could even shorten it. You could just say, well, we believe that rights are that the individual is more important than the group, not the group more important than the individual. But if you don't explain why and what that means, then people could say, well, that's not what, it means something else. So it's not only necessary to know what the idea is, but it's also necessary to define the idea in such clear terms that there's little or no room for misunderstanding what it means.
Is that essentially what has gotten away politics? I mean, it reminds me of a joke I came up with some time ago. Why did the government have to shut down all its public schools? Because they didn't have any principals.
Well, that's probably as good an answer as I could come up with. But then, being always the cynic that I am, I would say, well, no, they did have principles. They're just not our principles. And so they were acting in accordance with their own ideas and their own principles and their own strategies, and their objectives were totally different than ours. They want to enslave us. That's why they did it. But I still like your joke. It's you can laugh at it, but underneath it, there's a hidden truth that's much more grim.
Yes, it's called gallows humour, and as I like to say, dark times call for dark comedy. Yes. And I believe that when things are so terrible, so frightening to a large degree, when you're dealing with this huge tsunami of darkness coming at you, and you think about it in a repeated fashion, and you're like on a hamster wheel. Oh my God, this is happening. Oh my God, that happened. And you drive yourself very slowly but surely insane. If you lack a sense of humor
and desperation. I remember during the 1960s and 70s when I first had an opportunity to meet a couple of defectors from the Soviet Union at a time when things were really hard. And one of these guys was Yuri Bezmenov, who was a KGB agent, and he really took a great risk to defect, and they were looking for him. They would have killed him if they could have found him for quite a few years thereafter. But anyway, I was talking with Yuri, and he was cracking jokes of this kind that were commonly being circulated in the Soviet Union by the citizens. And one of them, I remember, the joke goes something like this. The students were in classroom, and the teacher was saying, who is the father of Russia? And it's Comrade Stalin. I see. And who will give you the food on your table? Comrade Stalin. And fine. Who is the father of your country? Comrade Stalin. And then finally, in the next lesson, the teacher asked the student, says, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And the kid says, "I want to be an orphan." And this was a Soviet joke, that came out of the Soviet Union in the 1960s. Well, now we've got those same jokes going around now. But underneath these jokes, it's a very serious situation.
How else are you supposed to deal with it is my question, because I have seen a lot of people in the chat room, and indeed I have removed to a large degree the intro for my show. I used to be a lot sillier, and I used to be laughing a heck of a lot more during these broadcasts, and I've toned it down to a far more serious level, specifically because people have been offended and they can't deal with it, and we're trying to get as many voters as we can. So if I can tone myself down for the good of the country, then perhaps that is a worthy sacrifice.
Well, it is a sacrifice if you've got a strong sense of humor like you do, and I also. My wife is always telling me, hey, cut the jokes out, or tone them down. And I know she's right, because you can go too far with those things. But it's hard to deal with such grim issues all the time without some release. But I've always objected to these endless rounds of jokes against criminal politicians and these guys who are launching wars that are responsible for the unnecessary death of millions of people. The guys who are, being paid graft millions of dollars to give speeches, and we know it's just under the table deals and like that. And so there are these jokes and cartoons on these people, and I really resent that, because I'm sure that I wouldn't like a joke about Adolf Hitler if I were living under that regime, you know? And these guys, there's a tendency if you laugh about something, well, then it's okay. You get over it. Oh, it's a joke, so it's not so serious. So then they forget about these crimes. And so I've always personally felt that a little bit of humor is a good thing, but boy, we're dealing with criminals here, and we don't want to just make it a joke and say, well, we laughed about them, and so therefore it's okay.
You're right, and I was thinking about indifference, actually. It's not fear of government or government reprisals for speaking out for your freedoms that actually keeps tyranny in place. It's the general populace's indifference to tyranny, their ability to just deal with it through jokes and by drinking and smoking weed and that kind of thing. If we are capable of being placated through entertainment, then the tyranny will continue. If all the comforts and all the entertainment were suddenly gone tomorrow, we would have a revolution before lunchtime.
Yeah, exactly my point, and said so much better. Yeah, we shouldn't trivialize these people. It's not trivial what they're doing.
How long have you actually been doing this, Ed? Because I've been talking on the show for a number of years now, about 12 years I've been doing this, and the amount of things that you learn on a daily basis when you're actually looking into the real fabric of reality is quite significant. And I believe that many of the answers that I have are lack confidence because I know that there's a lot that I still don't know, and that's by method of my experience. And I was just wondering how long you've been going through this for. I mean, I recall watching videos of you at the John Birch Society many decades ago talking about the Quigley formula and things of that nature, and I was just wondering how deep it has gotten to you, and have there been times that it hasn't been easy?
Well, I go back to, I remember my beginning to 1960. That's when I got my first red pill. In 1960. Of course, I had a lot more pills to take after that, but that was when I realized that I was living in a world which I really hadn't seen prior. I came up through the university, through a nice middle-class family, raised by a school teacher aunt. I came from a broken family, was taken in, luckily, by my aunt and my grandmother, raised by these two wonderful ladies and given a good education. So all of a sudden I was turned around and I had a lot of good, fortunate things happen to me. But I came through the system, thinking, oh, wow, this is a wonderful country, which it was, and our forefathers fought for our liberties. Thank God for that, because now we've got them. And I went all the way through school hearing that kind of a pep talk without realizing that during both of the world wars, World War I, before I was born, and then World War II, that during those periods of history, America was converting itself. I mean, not itself, but the leaders were turning America from a republic, or from what I like to call a protectorate, which is the way it was created, into a democracy. And that's another thing. I saw the word democracy in your review. The democracy, let's face it, is the worst, one of the worst forms of government there can be. And I know that that's not what these people are thinking about when they use the word, but they need to find out what that word really means. The rule of the majority without principle. And if you get 51% of the people to vote for something, does that mean that they can take all your property away because 51% of the people said they like it that way? That's democracy. And you've got to think, no. There are certain things that I don't care how many people want to do. It could be all but one man standing against all the rest, against millions, one against millions. Every individual has rights that you cannot take from them. I don't care how many votes you have. So things like that, I didn't realize that the United States was being converted into a democracy, a true democracy, which is horrible. And our founding fathers knew that, and they wrote about it. If you go back and read their debates and their letters, they said, let's never have a democracy in America. Let's have a republic, and they knew the difference. So the point is that I didn't realize that while I was living up until my first 25 years, I was living in a country that was crumbling. It was being converted rapidly into the very things we were fighting in those wars. They didn't know that. In the name of fighting collectivism, in the name of fighting under different names in the name of fighting Nazism and communism, which is different variants of this thing called collectivism. We were becoming a collectivist country on our own without even knowing what the heck was going on. So when I finally got the first look at that, which was in 1960, I couldn't get it out of my mind. It was just something that took me over my awareness, and I didn't know I had this crusader gene. It started to vibrate, and I'd never taken an interest before in these public matters. I just figured America was free, right? And it was always going to be great because our founding fathers, wrote the Constitution, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, well, it was locked down. I never realized it was being eroded even then. And so once I saw that, I had to break away from my corporate world in which I was already in. I was trying to climb the corporate ladder with a large company, and I quit my job and became a, quote, crusader. My poor wife almost had a cow. She said, "What are you doing? What are we going to, who's going to buy the groceries? Where are we going to get our money?" And all these perfectly logical questions. But it's been a battle ever since. So 1960 on, that's when I got into it. And I share your view, Vinny, when you say you've learned a lot, but you realize you still don't know a lot of things. I'm still in that condition, but back in 1960, I only had a couple of little glimpses at the picture. I had 90% of what, or 99% of what I've learned, I didn't know back then in those days. So.
And indeed, the technology that is being used to surveil us, to enslave us, and the technocratic control grid that's being built, there is an entire generation of people who grew up within that era who are unaware of not only that this technology exists, but how it works and how it's going to be used on them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, on them is exactly it. The technology is supposed to be so wonderful because it creates convenience, and it supposedly turns government away from these nasty politicians and turns it over to these honest technocrats who just believe in science, the purity of science, and all those fantasies. And so it's going on, and what they don't realize is that all this technocracy is viewed by our enemies, is viewed as weapons to be used against us and how to control us.
Speaking of control, the thing that you're most famous for is the creature from Jekyll Island, and when you look at the Federal Reserve system and how it operates, how it's set up in secret, and indeed how it basically enslaves people by creating its own value out of nothing in exchange for people's eternal work on their birth certificates, and then you look at the rest of the British banking colonies, Cayman Islands, New Zealand, that kind of thing, you realize that, hey, it's no wonder that these are incredibly corrupt countries that are run by organized crime. It's no wonder, because a fish rots from the head, as the old Chinese saying goes. Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, yes, the discovery of the Federal Reserve was a perfect example of what I was talking about a moment ago. I had no vision of that whatsoever when my crusader gene started to vibrate in 1960. I hadn't even thought about the money system as being a political weapon. Had no knowledge. I didn't know what money was. I just figured, well, the government was taking care of it, wasn't it? Well, they were, but not to the benefit of the people. I couldn't imagine a conspiracy so gross that our monetary system would be used by private bankers instead of the government, people we elected, and so forth. But I soon found out that the monetary systems of the world have been dominated and controlled by an elite banking cartel, or cartels. Actually, they're regionalized, but now they're pretty much amalgamating into one global cartel. But at the time I was taking an interest in this, every country had its own group of banks, which described themselves as central banks. That's the word you'll find in the encyclopedia, which means that they had gone into partnership with their respective governments, and they had received special treatment from governments to do things that other industries and other businesses couldn't get away with. They received a franchise to create money out of nothing. They received a franchise to lie about the status of their deposits. It was perfectly legal all of a sudden to take the thing we call demand deposits, which means supposedly you put money in a bank, but you have the right to demand it at any time. It's supposed to be on deposit in the vault. You can go in and demand your money, is why they call it a demand deposit. And that's the way it started off. But by the time I took a peek at it, that had already passed pretty much. Most of the money was no longer in the vault. It was used as the foundation for the creation of more money at a ratio of about 9 to 1, and it was all obligated. There was, in other words, at least 10 times more money in circulation as there were demands, or those were the demands, I should say. There's 10 times more demand in circulation than there was money in the vault to hand out. So, but they still called them demand deposits instead of being time deposits. So, but this was legalized. Everything that the banks did, if you and I were to do it, would be considered a gross crime. But the banks got away with it because they went into partnership with the governments. And the deal was that when the governments needed money, instead of having to go to the people and either get it from the people in the form of taxes, which is unpopular, or in the form of selling bonds to individual investors and corporations and so forth, which is expensive. They've got to pay those bonds back, plus interest. Well, they could just go to these, quote, central banks, and the banks would create the money out of nothing and lend it to the governments. That was an amazing. When I discovered that's how it worked, I couldn't believe it. They create money out of nothing and just lend it to the countries. And of course, now theoretically the countries owe it to the banks, but they never pay it, and the banks know that they're not going to pay it. So it's a kind of a good old boys club, and they worked it out, and the public didn't observe any of it, or if they observed it, they didn't understand it. It took me a long time to figure it out. The hardest part was to believe that it was actually so simple. It was such an obvious crime. It was theft. I couldn't. Well, how can they get away with this? And of course, I realized they got away with it is because no one understood it, and no one like myself could even imagine that they would try to do something that gross. So anyway, it was a long awakening process. And when you come out the other side of it, what does it mean? It means that these banks, these global cartels of banks, are independent of government, but yet they have all the government's money. And you know, if you have all the money in the world, if you can create it out of nothing, you can buy all the politicians. It's easy. And that's how the countries of the world got converted from a situation in which the governments controlled the banks, and then for the passage of maybe a decade or two, you looked at it and it was the other way around. Now the banks controlled the governments. And so that's what we live under today. We think that the Federal Reserve is a government agency. It's not. It's a private banking cartel. And it creates the money that's loaned to the government so that the government can do all these outlandish things without having to tax the people for it. But that means that the people have to pay for it in inflation, because the purchasing power of the dollar goes down as the numbers get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's a gigantic scam. And every transaction now that takes place is most of it like on a credit card transaction or a loan on some business enterprise or a mortgage or something. All of those transactions, a little piece of it goes to the banks, a little interest payment here, a surcharge there, and this happens over and over and over again. And you come to the realization that probably half of the productivity of the nation is going to the banks for nothing except to create money out of nothing and charging interest on it. And boy, when you come to this conclusion, you realize, how come I didn't learn about this in school? And now I know it's because the teachers don't know anything about it.
That's right. And as Friedrich Bastiat said, when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves in the course of time a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it.
perfect description, yes.
And just recently, we had the IMF be exposed by, I believe, the president of Bolivia. I'm not sure if it was the Bolivian president. They might be about to blow the Bolivian hell out of him. But anyway, he was offered a $900 million bribe by the IMF, which, of course, they created out of nothing, in exchange for starting up another COVID lockdown. You know, and it occurs to me that a lot of people are of good conscience and are reasonably bright, but they don't realize one critical factor about this world is that there are people in this world who are not like you. They do not think like you. They don't have difficulty sleeping at night because they do not have a conscience to keep them up.
And that's right. And they think of themselves as being morally superior because they think that people like you and I and the 99% out there as the useless eaters, the unwashed masses, they honestly believe, at least early in their development, that, well, people, if you give them freedom, they'll make bad choices. So we really need to control their lives for their own good. And they think that's because they've been to school and they've read Karl Marx and all of that and a few other books like that. They think that now that they have the superior knowledge and the intelligence and the morality to rule the rest of our lives. And somewhere down the line, the ones that climb all the way to the top realize that that's a lot of nonsense. But by that time, they enjoy the ride so much that they're not going to give it up. So it just becomes power after that point.
That's right. And at this point, I would like to just give a plug to myself. The Vinny Eastwood Show is listener-supported, ladies and gentlemen, so if you value the support being given to the NZPP, please consider making a donation or starting up an automatic payment. The details are in the description below. My special guest at the moment is G. Edward Griffin from the Red Pill University. Could you tell people a little bit about the Red Pill University there?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And in order to do that, I have to back up one notch and talk about Freedom Force and International, and then put it into context of Red Pill. Earlier, we were talking about the necessity to understand the principles of freedom, the basis of what it takes to be free. Most people think that freedom merely means being out of jail. They don't understand that it's much more complex than that, and they certainly don't understand how to guard freedom because they don't really know what it is. So we created this hardcore organization. When I say hardcore, I mean people who like to read books, people who like to think about the topics we're talking today, which is a small group of people percentage-wise, the people who really care, the people who are not in it for their own aggrandizement. They're not trying to make money from it. In fact, most of them are spending a lot of their hard-earned money just because they want to make it a better world. So we've created Freedom Force International for those of us who have the crusader gene, and we find ourselves as unable to avoid what we consider to be our responsibility to understand these issues and to try and share them and teach them to our fellow human beings and make a difference in the world. And we understood at some point, I understood very clearly after I got this movement going, which started in 2002, about 4 years into it, I realized that, it's great to have these principles and really understand academically what's going on, but you cannot change the world unless you have the support of a lot more people than those small numbers. 1% of the population can start a revolution. Like our American Revolution, it was less than 1% who were the real thought leaders, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the signers of the Constitution, the guys that wrote the pamphleteers, the ones that gave the speeches. You put them all on one list, probably about 100 or 150 people were responsible at the very top for the whole revolution. But they didn't fight the revolution. It took a lot more than 150 people. You need another 3% to mobilize the next 15% so that you can develop enough mass movement to actually make things happen. Now, you don't need more than about 15% because in all these revolutions, whether they're battlefield revolutions or ideological revolutions, it's 15%. that actually make it happen. And the other 65 or 85%, I should say, 85, they're looking around to see which side is going to win. That was the case in the American Revolution. Most of the people in the colonies, they didn't want to declare either one way or the other. Some of them left the country because they didn't want to take sides. But 15% showed up at the Bridge of Concord and at all the battlefields, and 15% distributed the pamphlets. So what we need now is 15%. That's what we're really looking for. So I thought, all right, we've got Freedom Force. We've got that little 1% or less. Now let's go, how do we talk to the 15%? So we realized we had to change our message a little bit, not to change it, but to generalize it, to not make it so difficult and so academic. We needed something that was more popular. We needed an image of something that really was true. It was not fake, but it wasn't so difficult to understand. So we thought, how do we do this to reach out to more people? And finally, we got the idea that maybe the red pill was the thing we should use to describe this. So we gave it a try. Back in 2017, we held our first Red Pill Expo in Bozeman, Montana, actually. We thought, well, nobody's going to come, especially to Bozeman. We thought maybe 100, 200 people might show up. Well, it turned out that a lot of people wanted to see Montana, like myself, had never seen it before, wanted to see Montana, thought it was a great place to go. And they came from all over the world. We had people from, I don't remember how many countries, but 6 or 7 countries, which amazes. We packed the place. Well, I think we had 600 people. Blew us away. We knew we had the right formula because we weren't talking about Save America or defend the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or all of these things that kinds of, unless you really understand them already, they sound dull. And the kids in school weren't interested in these things, but they'd seen the movie The Red Pill. They knew that, in that sci-fi movie called The Matrix, that if you took the red pill, then all of a sudden you could see reality the way it really was, instead of living in the illusion of the Matrix. So everything we really wanted to talk about could be explained in the concept of illusion versus reality. So we decided to water it down a little bit or popularize it, not to change the message, but just to change the tone or the depth of it. And it really worked. And people came and said, yeah, I see this. Oh, my gosh, I didn't know that. And now they're ready for the next step, which is to Freedom Force. Perhaps some of them are, not all. So we called that Project Outreach. It was so successful that we did another one and another one and another one. We had 4. We're working on our 5th one. We had to postpone a little bit because of the Covona Theater. But we also realized that 1 or 2 events a year is not going to cut it. I mean, we're fighting a war, and we need this enlightenment movement going 24/7, 365 days a year. So we came up with the idea of Red Pill University, which is a full-time proposition. And to make it short, Vinny, because I'm probably boring people, but to make it short, we decided not only the university, which is something going on basically on the internet, we have information there galore, but we need to create local campuses of this, because nothing is going to happen. You don't build a movement. Movements don't start from the top down. They always start from the bottom up. And unless we had boots on the ground, and until we could affect our city council and our county board of supervisors, and who's elected as a judge, and the sheriff, and the board of education, and all these local things, we're not going to build a movement until we have the local things. And so the goal now is to create campuses of the Red Pill University in every county in the United States and around the world. There are political counterparts to that. It's a very big project. We have very big, ambitious plans, but we are underway. So there you have the background, at least, of what Red Pill University is and what its relationship is to Freedom Force. Red Pill University is where we hope to reach 15% of the American people, and to the awareness that something needs to be done, and by golly, they're going to help us do it, and they're going to be in the forefront of it. So Red Pill University is the place to go for people who want to make a difference in the world.
Can you also elucidate on that just a little bit? I mean, what kind of are there, courses? Are there lecture theatres and things of that nature? I realise we might be on this topic a little bit too much at the moment, but my question is the direct application, the physical, where the rubber meets the road type of thing. Are there campuses? Are there lecturers? Are there lecture halls that are people signing up to get their education in the Red Pill University? Because as far as I know, a lot of people will pay large sums of money to be given little titles after their name or little pieces of paper or certificates that indicate that they are quite happy to sit there and not question anything and simply repeat what they're told verbatim, which doesn't indicate any form of intelligence.
Well, very good observation. Those people won't feel comfortable at our university. But the people who will feel comfortable are the ones who want to just learn enough to apply and to make a difference in the world, to push back this wave of collectivism that is about to overtake the whole world. And we do have courses. We call them courses or classrooms, but they're not the kind that you would find in the university. In other words, you don't have a 101 or 102 in psychology. When you come to redpilluniversity.org, you will see what the courses are like. They are presentations and documentaries, the best that we can find. We're loading them up at the average of maybe 3 or 4 new ones a week. We've already got a couple of hundred up there. And I think we've already attained our initial goal, which is to create the largest collection of reliable information of this kind, the biggest repository in the world for information of this kind. We've just begun. But that leads to the second point, and the second point relates to where the rubber meets the road. Our mission is not just to load you up with videos to watch and presentations and lectures and documentaries, because there comes a point where you think, oh, not another video. I've seen them all. Well, you haven't seen them all, but you get the idea soon enough after you've looked at maybe 100 documentaries or presentations, and you think, okay, now what do I do? What do I do to make a difference? I don't need any more information. And so that's where the rubber meets the road with our campuses. That's where the differences start to be made. And that's where we bring more people into the university to look at the videos that we've already seen. And it's an endless supply. I mean, you could spend your life watching videos already with what we've got. In fact, we just put one up the other day. It was one of the best documentaries I have ever seen, and it was about the life of George Orwell. I won't tell you any more, except that the documentary was done in the cinema verite style, which I studied in school when I went to film school. Cinema verite means that it looks like it's the real thing. You know that they're actors, but the way it's done, it just looks like it's the real thing, or you're watching newsreels or things like that. And it's all about not only Orwell, but what Orwell saw in the world as he matured and went through it, and a very strong closing on the meaning of the book 1984, things like that. But after you've seen these videos over and over, okay, I got it. Now what are we going to do about it? Now we turn our attention to the campuses, and that's where we recruit new people, and that's where we build political movements to have the right people go into our board of supervisors at the county level, get the right mayor in at the city level. Look at the mayors. Boy, the mayors in some of the biggest cities in the United States are turning out to be on the other side. They deliberately tell the police to stand down and let these destroyers burn and plunder stores and create so much havoc because they want an excuse for martial law. And so they tell the police to stand back. And people don't understand that. They say, why are the police standing back? Wake up. Wake up. It's because the mayor or the chief police had been put in by George Soros. See who paid for their campaign funds. The enemy is in control, ladies and gentlemen. And you're not going to solve that problem by just saying who you're going to vote for president or what political party you're going to support. You've got to get into the grassroots level and build this movement from the ground up. So, Vinny, that's my answer to your question. That's where the rubber meets the road, is at the campus level. And how many do we have? Well, we've got 2, and they're both under construction right now. And I hope that by the end of the year we'll probably have 20 or 30. And there's a lot of interest in them. And you're catching it at the very beginning now. I don't want to go to too much detail because people will say, well, send me a kit on how you form a campus, and we're working on that too. So, but that's where the rubber meets the road. I'll just stop talking at that.
Well, it seems to me, Ed, that if you've been doing this since 1960, what's that now? Now about 60 years, you've been fighting for truth and freedom in such a graceful manner. I believe that what's happened to you in the last decade or two is you have started to, whether or not you realize it, think about legacy and what will be left for future generations when you're gone, and I can't ask you any questions anymore.
A very profound observation, Vinny, because you're right. Young people don't think about legacy, and they're in a hurry. I remember when I was young at the beginning end of this in the 1960s and 70s, I looked around and there was the old folks, the old fogies who were recognized as leaders of the movement. Maybe they were called the Godfathers, I don't know. But all these old guys, and I was so impatient. I said, come on, we want this I want action. I want to see things change by the next election. And I remember that some of these guys would say, son, let me explain it to you. This is a generational process. It took our enemies 2 or 3 generations to get where they are now. And you're not going to do that in the next 2-year political cycle. You got to work backwards and push back in what they teach in the schools, who's running the media, what's going on in the churches, everything they've done. They've got to reverse this process, and that's going to take time. Well, I was in a hurry. I didn't want to hear that. But now I'm one of those old fogies saying, well, son, it's not going to happen by the next election. But now we come to the legacy part. It is going to happen. And one of the most pleasant things I can do is go to sleep at night or go to bed and close my eyes and think, well, we laid another brick in the foundation. Now, it's going to take a little while before that foundation has more bricks on top of it, but we're building something now that cannot be stopped. And I may not be here to see it, but I know that it'll happen. And that's good enough for me. It's something that makes me feel that I'm serving my purpose for being born.
I recall having a conversation with one of my listeners, and he watches a lot of videos and that kind of thing, but doesn't actually do anything with that knowledge. And I said, well, the knowledge you never use is the very definition of useless knowledge. And there are so many people who, I think we alluded to this before, why are the police doing that? Why is this happening? Why? They only know one question, like a child. And if you don't know who did it, what happened, when it happened, how it happened, what use is it to know why? Okay, this is how we understand facts and reality, and I think that a lot of people are dedicated to this concept of belief. Right? I believe this is the case. I believe that is the case. And I found out probably in a very harsh manner that reality doesn't care what I think. It doesn't care what I believe.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. And you have to recognize that we're in a real war. And this is, although it has an ideological foundation, it's a very physical war, or it's about to become, I'm afraid, even more physical than we ever dreamed it would be in our lifetime. And it reminds me of a very good friend of mine some years ago. He was a doctor, and he stood firm against the medical establishment because they told him to stop using a treatment for cancer that was not approved by the government. And he said, what do I care if it's approved or not? I'm saving lives, and this junk that we get from the pharmaceutical company is killing people, and you're telling me I have to use the junk and I can't save lives? And they said yes. So he got into that battle, and he stood up. He put his whole career on the line. But I remember with him, and he reached in his pocket and he pulled out his little pocket copy of the Constitution. And he says, they can't do these things to me because I've got the Constitution to protect me. And of course, they put him in jail. Constitution by itself doesn't protect anybody. You've got to have boots on the ground. You've got to have power. You've got to be able to have conviction and courage. You have to stand for what you believe in, and you must have the power. Otherwise, as you said, I mean, they don't care what you believe. They don't care if you're holding up the Constitution. They don't care what's legal or not legal. They don't care if they have the power. And this is the red pill that people need to take. If we don't have the power, we're going to lose.
And that's what Freedom Force International was created for. Those without power cannot defend freedom.
Exactly. I'm glad you spotted that as our slogan, our motto, I should say.
Now, we have less than a minute left in the presentation. We've run through the creed of freedom. You were talking about the chasm earlier. Would you be able to enlighten people as to what this is about?
Yes, earlier you found in the Creed of Freedom all of these principles, you know, you read them off. Well, they're just statements of principles. Now, most people will read those and say, yeah, that sounds good, but I wonder how it applies. You know, they're little statements, right? So I created the chasm as a document to back up all of those statements in the Creed. If anybody reads the chasm, they will understand all the history and all the logic that supports the Creed of Freedom. And I consider it to be one of the most important, if not the most important document I've ever written. And I had the feeling that, you know, I wasn't really writing it because I stole so many ideas from previous freedom fighters and authors. I mean, everything Jefferson said, and even Hamilton, who was sort of a Federalist, and Frederick Bastiat, and John Locke, and all of the great thinkers of history. I felt that they were pushing these ideas through my head, and it's all there in the chasm. If anybody is wondering, you know, how does this apply, these principles, to things like health care? I noticed in your document for the new political party, there was something about, you know, we stand for public health and safety. Well, that phrase, public health and safety, is being used to justify the lockdowns and all the terrible things that are happening to people. So that's why I think we have to be very careful about the words we use, because we might be just giving the enemy ammunition if we don't know how they twist words around. So anyway, when it comes to the creed, there are words, and they need to be defined and understood, and that's the whole purpose of that essay called The Chasm. The chasm stands for the great divide between 2 points of view. Those 2 points of view in life are collectivism versus individualism. 2 ideological points of view, I should say. When we have all these debates about fascism, communism, Nazism, socialism, you know, all of these different isms, the left versus the right, the Republicans versus the Democrats, none of those words mean anything because you cannot define them. But you find out that all of that boils down to just 2 words that can be defined. And they were well-known words and used in the literature 100 years ago, but you hardly ever find them today. We're trying to put those words back into the dictionary, back into the vocabulary. And those words are collectivism versus individualism. All of those tyrannies that we mentioned, communism, fascism, Nazism, they're nothing but collectivism. They're just variants of collectivism. And the only thing on the other opposite side of all of those is this thing called individualism. And that the words almost tell you what it is. One of the concepts that you'll see in the Creed of Freedom is that one of the creed is that we believe that the individual is more important than the group. And of course, the collectivists believe that the group is more important than the individual, and that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. And that's the idea that really is at the basis of all of this villainy. I can assure you that if I'm a tyrant, there is no crime I can think of, no mass murder I could think of, no invasion, no treason that I could think of that couldn't be defended afterwards by saying, well, it was bad, but it was necessary for the greater good of the greater number. And that's the excuse, the logic, the morality behind all of these collectivist forces. So that's the kind of thing we talk about in the chasm, and that's the division. I think most people, if they're thinking people and they're not trying to take advantage of their fellow human beings, they'll recognize when they study these principles that, oh my gosh, I'm an individualist and didn't even know it. That's what I hope will happen, and frankly, that is what happens in most cases.
G. Edward Griffin has been my very special guest. You can get more of his information at redpilluniversity.org, and the things that we've been showing on the homepage there, freedomforceinternational.org, is the one to look at. And if you go to the Creed of Freedom page, right down the bottom of it, there's a little link for the chasm there, and I'll just demonstrate that for you right now. This is the Freedom Force page, and I believe we have the Creed of Freedom right there. And if you go to the Creed of Freedom page and scroll right down to the bottom, you can then click that little link there that says The Chasm, which will take you to this document if you do wish to know more. Thank you so much.
I'll put the chasm in the main index on the left side of the page so you can go directly to it. If it's not already there, I'll see that it is within 10 minutes after we're through.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. Ed, thank you so much for your 60 years of dedication to the cause of liberty and freedom, not only for Americans, but you have inspired countless others worldwide.
Well, thank you, Vinny, and thank you for your great work that you're doing. I've been aware of your work for how many years now? It's quite a few.
Since we began, I think. Yeah,
they've been firing at you, I know, but every time the smoke clears, you're still standing, so keep it up.
Yeah, we'll see if we can. And that's the other thing about it, is it's going to turn ugly. I fear that it's going to get very, very ugly. And some of my friends who taught me most of what I know about New Zealand and the terrible reality of this place, they're not here anymore. And maybe that was for the best, so that those of us who can weather this storm will choose to do so. But it's a sad realization when you look at how long you or I have been keeping on this exact same path towards freedom, towards truth, and to see how many other people have just come and gone and felt, no, this is too hard, I'm going to give up, I'm going to go get a job in Wall Street.
I know, that's how it happens. As I said, in the time of the American Revolution, a lot of people made that same decision, not Wall Street, but they decided to go to Canada or whatever, escape the conflict rather than take the responsibility to stand for what they believed in.
And that's what it's about, ladies and gentlemen. It is our responsibility. G. Edward Griffin, redpilluniversity.org. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Vinny. Again, soon.
See you, mate. Ooh. There we go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there he goes. The other things I need to do a little bit of housekeeping here. First of all, the reason why I do this show is because of my little baby over here. So we're just going to give you about 10 seconds of that.
Mother loves us. Daddy loves you so much because you're just so cute. All right, that's enough. That's enough.
This is my baby. It's just so cute. So again, ladies and gentlemen, we are supporting the Advanced New Zealand Public Party throughout this, having great guests just like G. Edward Griffin on the show, and ensuring that the wealth of knowledge around this world is being brought to bear on this broadcast, ladies and gentlemen. If you go back through the archives of the Vinny Eastwood Show on YouTube, you will see an incredible amount of interviews with remarkably good guests that are very, very difficult to even come by, and I am extremely grateful for their time and their expertise supporting this show. Speaking of gratitude, I do realise that I'm incredibly ungrateful a lot of the time, ladies and gentlemen. I don't go and thank you personally for all of your donations, all of your automatic payments and things of that nature. I'm not exactly systematic in that way. So if you have made a donation, if you have started up an automatic payment to the Vinny Eastwood Show, thank you. Thank you so much for every single cent, for every single second of your attention, and for all the time that many of you have spent giving likes, subscribing to the channel, encouraging others to watch these shows by sharing them to your social media and various other platforms. I am an ungrateful little child, and I am very grateful, ladies and gentlemen, for all that support. Thank you so much. Now, if you want to support this show and my ongoing work helping out the NZPP, you can go to thevinnieeastwoodshow.com. That's Vinny with a Y, because it's the most important question, and Eastwood like go ahead, make my news. And go ahead, ladies and gentlemen, you can make a donation through the KIWIBANK PayPal drop down bars. You can do either monthly or weekly donations through PayPal, or in any amount you wish through the KiwiBank there. And I keep forgetting to tell you that there are in fact rewards. So on that homepage of the VinnyEastwoodShow.com, ladies and gentlemen, there is a little thing on the side that just says, have you already donated? This is on the homepage, by the way. Click here to get your special rewards. And when you click on that, ladies and gentlemen, after you've made a donation, it'll take you straight through to the rewards page, where you can join the what's it called? You can join the secret Vinny Eastwood Show Facebook group and join all the other donors in there. You can also have access to the unlisted videos playlist with a bunch of very, very important videos that would be really seminal, especially for New Zealanders to watch, including a interview with a former police constable, and we talked about all the training protocols they went through, what the back end of being a police officer is like, and that was probably the most eye-opening interview, or at least top 10 most eye-opening interviews out of the 4,000 shows that I've done over the last 12 years. So any of you who have donated, make sure that you go onto the homepage of the VinnyEastwoodShow.com and click that little link that says click here for your special rewards if you've already donated. In addition, if you are a donor, send me suggestions. All right, at the moment, up until the end of the election, or at least, we are hoping to get people on who of either international nature, who have expertise in particular fields that you might think that either New Zealand Public Party members might need to know, or the leadership themselves may need to hear. So any suggestions along that line would be great, as well as New Zealand activists on those same topics and issues. This is a very, very broad show, and it has to be, essentially, because the truth doesn't care what you believe. It is what it is, ladies and gentlemen. With that being said, thank you again so much to the moderators. I'll switch to the screen share for the moment. Jimmy James, Marley Pumpkin, Amos 77, Richard Bonner, Michelle Canham, Free, and so many others as well that I don't really have so much of a list of all you guys. TJ Antipas is there as well, guys. Yeah, seriously, I am really happy for all of you here, and thank you so much for helping me moderate the chats and keep the riff-raff out. You guys have done an amazing job there. All right. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen, to the Vinny Eastwood Show. I'm not a credible journalist. I'm an incredible journalist.